Okay, I have the unenviable task of following that talk. And I'm going to try to keep us on time. We're going to change gears just a little bit. I'm going to provide some information for a workshop that was just conducted in February of this year. And this was focused on standardizing reporting language. So we've talked a lot at this workshop this week about the increasing use of DNA sequencing for resistance detection. And one of the things I hope you noticed during many of those presentations were the differences in terms of the output for the reports that are coming out of these different types of systems that we have. All of them good, all of them valuable, all of them beneficial, but in terms of the language that we're speaking, we're all looking at it in a little bit different way. And so one of the hopes, and maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I like to be optimistic, is that at some point we can develop standards so that we can all be speaking the language in the same way. So obviously the need for this is clear communication, but the level of detail required may differ. We have the clinical care need, we have the surveillance need, we have the clinical trial need, we have the research and development needs. We have lots of different audiences that participate as part of the system. And currently there's not a particular template or consensus-based document that we can point to that directs us on the best way in which to report these. So collectively we're trying to make an effort towards driving that standardization. So there was a workshop that was conducted in early February of this year in London. It was hosted by CPTR, WHO, and DAIDS. It included a group of about 25 subject matter experts that were laboratorians, epidemiologists, clinicians, and industry partners that had some type of experience with either producing these types of results, analyzing these results, or using these results for patient care. And although we didn't seek consensus, it was more an opportunity to begin this discussion. We know there's much more work that will need to be done in the coming months to years. But we found, once we had these very rich and robust discussions, that there were places where we were generally in agreement for an approach. So here are a listing of the workshop goals. Those included discussing terminology, options for reporting formats, considering relevant language for results, for both conventional and next-generation sequencing assays, identifying what are the essential components for a report, talked a lot about discordance and how to deal with that, outlined knowledge gaps, and then talked about next steps. So there were some predominant themes that came out of the discussions. One overarching theme is that simplicity is optimal. We can make these very complex and include all the information that we have available to us. But at the end of the day, especially when we're talking about clinical management and clinical decision making, we really felt that simplicity was key. And that reporting an R or an S in terms of resistant or susceptible, and maybe another category indeterminate or inconclusive, we did have a lot of discussion about which term is most effective for using, it may not yet be possible. We felt that R right now, in terms of ruling in resistance, in many cases is a lot easier than a high confidence in terms of an S. That differs, obviously, depending on which locus we're talking about and which drugs. So that sort of drives that need for filling in some of these knowledge gaps and having more information. I think we saw a good example of that with the bedaquiline presentation in RVO 678, and that if we knew now what we knew then, what we know now, and those types of things. So filling in those gaps in knowledge. And then the clinical outcome data, which are sorely lacking in many cases in terms of trying to put all the pieces together, are really needed, and had a lot of discussion about the need to participate in terms of clinical trials, sequencing of isolates that may be available, all of those things to sort of interact and collaborate where we can to sort of increase the knowledge base. And other predominant themes were that a classification scheme for mutations, whatever we want to call it, if it's high, moderate, low confidence, indeterminate, inconclusive, or not associated, that we really need to think about a classification scheme. And this is not unsimilar to or dissimilar to what you see with the HIV Stanford database, a very similar sort of thought process in terms of being able to classify mutations. We talked about statistical approaches and landed on a general consensus that really we need more information in terms of minimum inhibitory concentration for specific mutations and being able to make those associations. But obviously there's some method dependency depending on how that's done. And then we also talked about the fact that sequencing approaches bring new challenges, and we've talked about that as well during this week. For the lab in terms of QC, reproducibility, the qualifications of staff, and for the clinic and program in terms of education and training. And that's something that we haven't hit on as much this week, but certainly something that we need to keep in mind as we talk about rollout of these types of assays. So the report at minimum should include the following, and I don't think this is shocking or surprising to anyone in the room, but the thing here is that if we don't have the conversation, we can never land on a document, right? We can never land on this guidance that we need. So here's just a listing: the drug, the genomic target, the specific mutation, or if no mutation is detected, to use that terminology, no mutation detected, to include the nucleotide change and the amino acid change when that's applicable, to include a category for resistance prediction, and to have interpretive comments. And we felt that if there was a clear high confidence mutation, something like an S531L, that maybe we were good enough at this point to say in the resistance prediction to just say resistant, and then really what additional interpretive comments might be needed. Maybe that's limited in that particular situation. But for others where we may have less confidence, moderate or low confidence, thinking about what additional information we might include in the interpretation. So in reporting the mutations, we would include the nucleotide change and consider the inclusion of genomic coordinates, especially as we're looking at movement to whole genome sequencing. To include mixed base calls, we've talked about that in terms of the difference, in terms of proportion of reads that might be included for specific alleles. And one of the decisions that's going to have to be made, and I've heard some of this discussion this week, is above what threshold. And I think we still need data in terms of this clinical outcome data and what becomes significant. We have the classical microbiology example with 1% is considered resistant. Are we going to use that same scenario for next-gen sequencing for the mutations that are detected? We landed on using a 3-letter amino acid abbreviation as opposed to a 1-letter abbreviation, and that was mainly because we just don't want to learn the 1-letter abbreviation for the amino acids. So it's a little bit easier. And then I think this is the one thing that I was very pleased to see come out of this consultation. Some of you may not realize that we don't use the M. tuberculosis numbering system for all of the different genes that we talk about. Our POB, we're using E. coli numbering system. GRA, we're often using E. coli numbering system. So one of the things that came out of this consultation is an endorsement for using the M. tuberculosis numbering system. Now, did anyone have a heart attack just then when I said that? I know, we're going to have to sort of learn a new language here and learn things in a different way, but I was actually happy to see that. Another not surprising outcome is avoiding technical terminology. Is there ever an instance where we need to say synonymous or non-synonymous on a report? So, and including silent mutations, as those may become increasingly important, and it also gives us information about detection of resistance with probe-based assays. Okay, so this was the most complex of concepts discussed, the mutation and prediction of resistance, and we spent a lot of time talking about this. There's obviously variability depending on the drug and the method that might be used for the phenotypic testing. There are gaps in our knowledge. There's the issue of novel mutations and how to treat those. And really, it all circled back to the need for this large, globally representative database where we can have as much volume of data in there so we can really interrogate that to learn more about drug resistance. And felt that in terms of classifying mutations and looking at prediction, that a consensus-based approach was key. Again, to have this column where we might put R, S, and I, and we can argue over what the I should be called. And then for those where it's clearly resistant, I mentioned putting an R, and maybe limitations on the amount of interpretive comment that's needed. We felt, and this would be an opportunity for you all to provide input, that for other types of mutations we have less information, that column would either be left blank, or there might be something that says see comments. And the reason is because if we put something in there like likely resistant or moderate confidence in terms of resistance, the concern is that the word resistance will be seen and that the additional information in terms of the interpretive criteria or interpretive comments might be missed. And so there was a thought to sort of direct folks to those interpretive comments. And then we talked about susceptibility and how confident do we really need to be. So I think I've gone through most of this. Obviously, for those that we have some clinical outcome data on, that would be key to include with help with interpretation. And then the final bullet point here, I think, cannot be overemphasized. As we're talking about development of a standard, word choice is going to be very important because we're going to be translating this into different languages, and the meaning and clarity of that message has to be maintained when those translations are made. Okay, so here's some examples of differences in types of interpretive comments. And you see the different types of terminology that's used here. Even things so simple as probably rifampin susceptible, does that mean the same thing as likely rifampin susceptible, or would people see those messages differently? So it's complex. At the surface, I was talking about this in our surveillance work group meeting, at the surface it sounds, well, that's easy. Somebody just develop some language and throw it out there. But we all see things in a little bit different way. And Dr. Castro made a very good point about whatever consensus-based document or template that we land on, really making sure that we have clear guidance in terms of definitions associated with that language. So other topics that were considered, that bioinformatics expertise is not available in all settings. That's something that we need to consider, and that there are different regulatory requirements, especially in terms of the personnel that could potentially perform this type of testing. The training needs, lots of training is needed. In terms of templates, beta testing of any reporting schemes that are devised, and inclusion of case studies, which I find is always helpful when you're doing training and education. Training for laboratory consultants that may be helping to implement these types of technologies so that they understand the expertise, have the expertise that they need, and also the ability to provide troubleshooting. And then for next generation sequencing, other things that we considered for the report are disclosure of the analytic pipeline that's used and the version of that, the proportion of reads with a particular mutation, and the depth of coverage, that those things may become important as well. And as I mentioned, the HIV model, in terms of the clear controlled messages and guidelines, we have that to look to that can sort of help shape our thinking as we move forward. So the next steps, obviously development of a manuscript that will be detailing the outcomes from the proceedings, or proceedings from the workshop, to promote the use of the M tuberculosis numbering system. So we all have to raise our hand at the end of this talk and solemnly vow that we will use the M tuberculosis numbering system. To develop draft reporting templates, to engage a larger audience, and I'm really excited about this. WHO is committed to facilitating a broader discussion about this particular issue with a larger audience. Obviously, 25 very smart people got together and talked about it, but we want to include as many great thinkers as we can about this particular issue. And so I look forward to hearing more about that process in the future. And then we want to identify collaborative opportunities to close knowledge gaps and maybe make those connections and networks where they need to be made. To circulate a panel of isolates for EQA, especially for next-gen sequencing, which I think is very important and would be very valuable, and then to generate training modules. So we have an opportunity with ReSec-TB. You've heard about ReSec-TB mentioned. You're going to hear about it after the break. Future enhancements for ReSec-TB could include a clinical use interface. And that would be wonderful. And so I think we have an opportunity here as we're talking about development of reporting language with these parallel processes. Hopefully they will converge. And what we would have is an opportunity to sort of establish this template or establish this standard language in terms of the output with something like ReSec-TB. So lots of folks that participated. Here's the acknowledgments. I want to thank everyone, many of them are in this room, that participated as part of this conversation, and there will be more work to do, and hopefully you all will contribute to that as well. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, I'm just wondering, if you get a lot of really smart people together in a room who are very sophisticated thinkers, and you think about the end game of what a report would look like, that might be a very different picture than if you go down to where you ultimately want to be, where you don't have that sophistication. And I'm just wondering, what does a template look like, and how much time the docs actually have to make a decision? Because I think one of the presentations I saw yesterday or the day before is, on average, they're spending 6 minutes with a patient. And they got a room full of others to look at. So I'm just wondering, did you entertain the idea of bringing in like informational graphical thinkers, people who may not be in diagnostics or clinical management, but they actually are very good at coming up with schemes for very simply with rich graphics. Boom, here's a snapshot. Now you may have exclamation marks, and you please refer to footnotes, but just thinking about what that end customer looks like and their sophistication and their commensurate needs for reporting.
So two things. It's a very, very good point. I think some of this has been addressed in the literature in clinical pathology reports in terms of looking at format. Even the amount of white space that you have in a laboratory report can help direct folks to the correct place. So I think having that input will be key. And I didn't put what is currently drafted, but it is a rather simplistic approach. I think we can, to use a term, I don't know if it's a real word, complexify it as much as we would like, but I agree that simplicity is key. And the other thing that we did talk about, what I mentioned in the slide set, is that beta testing. So we could even have different types of reporting formats to see, and beta test those, to see ultimately which one really provides the most value.
So, thanks, Angela. I think this is really great, and I applaud the working of the group. I think Jan's very appropriately acknowledged that we are going to need to implement the principles of change management at a time when you're going to be transitioning from what we've all learned into relearning and retrofitting a lot of stuff. And it occurs to me that we should identify some key target scenarios of professional societies where we have plenary sessions to really start the conversation, start illustrating the output of this, obtaining the feedback. In the U.S., I'm familiar with APHL, ASM, and Europe there's a similar, in Africa there's the African side of medical micro. Then if you look at it from the clinician side, there's the American Thoracic Society and IDSA are going to be the key subspecialists providing care. And then from there, obviously, you want to move into the more generalist audience. But it really is going to be a challenge, and I think we should not underestimate the attention that's going to need to be paid to retraining ourselves so that we can retrain the others.
No, I appreciate that comment, especially with the movement to a different numbering system, because, I mean, admittedly, I'm S531L, now I have to think 450, so it's just thinking about things in a different way, and that education and training piece is going to be key.
So I just would like to make one comment to simplicity. We have compared 4 tools or 5 tools that obviously have been designed to report resistances from sequencing data. And in a simple word, you would think that they report the same, and they don't. And actually, I mean, if we just have a system that basically says resistant or no, we must be quite sure that this reporting is correct. In fact, when you report mutations that are either related to resistance or not, based on the knowledge of the person that gets the report, they can make their own judgments. If you just have a graphical table saying resistance or no, with no further information how this has been generated, that is nice because it's easy, but it might also lead to a lot of wrong assumptions and decisions. So I think there must be a balance between simplicity, but of course some decent information how the softwares really generate the information. And that is, I think, crucial. And I was quite surprised that even for INH and rifampicin, those softwares generate false positive and false negative results from sequencing data. You would obviously think that this is easy to be done.
Yeah.
That's not the truth.
No, agreed.
Yeah, and it just prompted me to think it'd be very interesting to see what regulators think about a clinical decision tool. Does that fall under device regulation? Because if it leaves a clinician to say, okay, this said this is resistant, therefore, or not resistant, therefore I'm going to treat, and bad things happen,
Who's liable for
who's
that?
liable?
That's exactly. Yeah.
I just want to make one point. I think if you think about RPIB5 beyond S to L in South Africa in the context of the healthcare work that I have to include, and I think so education is key. We have to have a curriculum if we're going to change
That's right.
Because all I know at the moment is S now.
Yep.
S now.
Yep. Agreed. Last comment.
Is it possible to have, Heike, is it possible to have you address Jim's question? Are you allowed to say anything about that? Jim, can you repeat your question for Heike?
So is this a clinical report? Where's Heike? Yeah, okay. Is this a clinical report, if it's interpreted as mitigating disease or diagnosis, does it fall under the device regulations? And if so, is there a legal liability if you're looking at use in the United States for potential post-market adverse event monitoring and then medical device reporting? Is it a device or is it guidance and you leave the decision to the clinician under the practice of medicine?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I can actually answer that right now. I think it would depend on how you phrase the intended use and if it then gets classified as a device. I know that when it's surveillance, and for example, when we're looking at use of sequencing in the type of scenario of outbreak surveillance in a hospital, and the result is not reported to a patient, it is not a device. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a topic to tackle separately, but it's not so black and white.
I actually had another comment for Angela. I was wondering, so for the FDA Argos database, we also sometimes get some antimicrobial resistance data, and we've been working with NCBI to put that into their database. And I know they're working on a template, and it's a big discussion about when to put the R, the I, the S, and they're requiring with it a value. So we are not allowed or we're not able to put the value on the interpretation unless we have a value. I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about it in the group.
So there's actually going to be a talk in the next session that will talk more about classification of these mutations, which might provide a little bit more information about that particular aspect. So we went over a little bit, I'm sorry. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break and then come back for the next session.